A man with nothing to offer. A woman who had everything to lose. One backpack left behind in the rain. And a choice neither of them saw coming. If you've ever been told your life isn't worth saving, this story is for you. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Follow along to the end, because this one doesn't go where you think it will. The night it started, Mason Reed was already running late. He had $40 in his checking account, a deadline he hadn't told his client about, and an 8-year-old daughter sitting on the front steps of their apartment building in the rain because he'd miscalculated the bus schedule by 12 minutes. Again. Lily had her hood up and her arms crossed, and the particular expression she'd inherited from nobody he could identify. This flat, patient disappointment that made him feel like the worst kind of failure every single time she aimed it at him. "I told you 5:15, she said. "I know. It's 5:27. "I know, Lily." She stood up, grabbed her backpack, the purple one with the broken zipper she refused to let him throw away, and walked past him without another word. He followed her up the stairs, already calculating dinner, already thinking about the Henderson Project files open on his laptop, already adding the missing school permission slip to tomorrow's mental list. He did not notice, at any point that evening, that the backpack she'd set down by the door was slightly lighter than usual. He would figure that out at 9:43 p.m., when Lily called from her bedroom asking if he'd seen her library book. The library book was checked out under his name. The late fee was already 3 weeks overdue. And the library book, along with her math workbook, her pencil case, and the small photo she kept tucked in the front pocket, the only photo she had of her mother, was sitting in a hotel lobby 12 blocks away because Lily had left her entire backpack behind when they ducked in to use the lobby bathroom during the worst of the downpour. Mason stood in the hallway for a moment, just standing there, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll go get it," he said. "You don't have to." "Lily, it's raining." "It was already raining. Go to sleep. I'll be back in an hour." She gave him that look again, the one that said you always say an hour. He grabbed his jacket and his keys and went back out into the night, and if he'd known then what that walk would cost him, or what it would eventually give him, he probably still would have gone. Because of the photo. Because Lily never asked for much, and she never complained about much, and the one thing she'd asked him 2 years ago was whether they could keep the picture by her bed. He wasn't going to let her lose it to a lost and found bin. The Alderton Hotel was not the kind of place Mason Reed had any business being. He knew that the moment the revolving door pushed him into the lobby, and a wave of climate-controlled air hit him, along with the low, deliberate hush of expensive carpeting and indirect lighting designed to make money feel inevitable. The ceilings were high. The flowers on the reception desk were real and probably cost more than his electric bill. A man in a suit near the elevator looked at Mason, his damp jacket, his worn work boots, the water dripping from his hair, and seemed to calculate something unflattering in about 2 seconds. Mason didn't care. He walked to the front desk. The woman behind the counter was professionally pleasant. Yes, someone had turned in a backpack, purple, broken zipper, children's items inside. She'd have to call the manager on duty to retrieve items from the secured lost and found. Would he mind waiting in the seating area? He minded, but he said no and went to stand near a column at the edge of the lobby, arms crossed, watching the door. That was when the woman walked in. He noticed her because she was moving fast and she was alone, which was unusual given the way the hotel staff snapped to attention the second she crossed the threshold. She was maybe 30, dressed in a dark coat that probably cost more than Mason's monthly rent, her hair down and damp at the ends from the rain. She was on the phone, half listening to whoever was on the other end, scanning the lobby with the particular look of someone who'd spent years walking into rooms and immediately identifying who in them needed to be managed. Her gaze passed over Mason, paused for a half-second, moved on. He looked away. She moved toward the elevator bank, stopped, said something sharp into the phone, and hung up. Then she turned and walked to the front desk instead, and Mason, who was not paying attention, stepped backward to make room for her without looking and stepped directly onto the hem of her coat. She lurched. He caught her arm on instinct. She caught herself on the desk. For a moment they were just close together, her hand gripping the desk edge, his hand still on her arm, both of them slightly frozen. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "That was entirely me. I wasn't watching. She looked at him. Not the fast appraisal from before, actually looked at him for a moment. You're fine, she said. It happens. She said it like she meant it, which surprised him. He'd expected something cooler. She turned back to the desk and he stepped away, and that was almost the whole story. A near fall in a hotel lobby, a brief apology, a nothing encounter in a nothing evening. Except the front desk clerk chose that exact moment to reappear and address them both simultaneously, having apparently forgotten she was dealing with two separate people. I have the backpack ready. I'm here for the backpack, Mason said. The woman in the dark coat had also turned. She looked at him again. Purple, she said. Broken zipper. He stared at her. That's my daughter's backpack. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite embarrassment, but a recalibration. My assistant called it in, she said. A child left it near the elevator. I assumed... She stopped. It's yours. It's my daughter's. She's 8. The clerk was looking between them with visible discomfort. The woman in the coat pulled out her phone, typed something quickly, and set it on the desk facing Mason. On the screen was a photo. The backpack, clearly photographed for documentation purposes, with a neat handwritten note attached. Items inventoried. Nothing removed. I had them photograph everything before it went to Lost and Found, she said, so you'd know nothing was touched. That was not what he'd expected either. Thank you, he said, and meant that too. The clerk retrieved the backpack. Mason checked the front pocket. The photo was there. A little girl about 5 years younger in a hospital bed, tired but smiling. Lily next to her with one hand on her arm. He zipped it back up. When he looked up, the woman was still standing there, and he got the impression she hadn't planned to be. She okay? The woman asked, nodding toward the backpack. Your daughter. She's good. She keeps this picture. He stopped, because that was more than the situation called for. She's fine. She's at home. The woman nodded. There was something in her face that was hard to read. Not pity, which he would have hated, more like something that had briefly surfaced and was being put back down. Good, she said. A man in a suit appeared at her elbow and she turned, and that was the end of it. Mason carried the backpack through the lobby and out through the revolving door and back into the rain, and he did not look back, and he did not ask her name. He found out who she was 6 days later when a friend texted him a link to a Forbes profile. Aurora Sterling, the billionaire reinventing urban tech and why nobody can predict her next move. He stared at the photo for a few seconds. Closed the link. He had a deadline. Mason had come to Chicago by choice, which most people from where he grew up considered a personality flaw. You didn't choose Chicago winters. You didn't choose a city that ate buildings for breakfast and charged you for the privilege of watching. But he'd done his architecture degree at the University of Illinois, fallen hard for the city during a summer internship, and stayed. First for a firm that laid him off after 2 years, then for a series of freelance contracts that paid unevenly but kept him working, and then, 3 years ago, for a reason he hadn't anticipated. He'd become a father. It wasn't how he'd planned it. He and Diane had dated for a little over a year, a relationship that was comfortable more than anything else, both of them circling something more serious without quite committing to it. When she got pregnant, they tried to make it work. They hadn't. Diane had struggled with her health through most of the pregnancy, and for 2 years after, the hospital photo was from one of the bad stretches. And she had finally, without anger or drama, told Mason that she couldn't do it. Any of it. She left them both the apartment lease, a small savings account, and a guilt-free exit that he'd spent 3 years not being sure how to feel about. Lily didn't ask about her mother much. When she did, Mason was honest in the way that was appropriate for an 8-year-old, that Diane loved her and was sick and wasn't able to be there, and that was nobody's fault. He didn't know if he was doing that right. He didn't know if he was doing most of it right. What he knew was the apartment on Karlov Avenue, a 2-bedroom that was 2 bedrooms only in the loosest interpretation of the word. His office was a converted closet where he kept his drafting table and his laptop, and when projects were going well, a decent pair of Bluetooth speakers that Lily had already claimed for her own use. He knew the building. A 6-story walk-up with loud pipes and a super named Dell who fixed things on a 3-day delay but always showed up eventually. And neighbors who had evolved over 5 years from strangers into something harder to categorize. There was Carmen on the second floor, who watched Lily on days when Mason's schedule went sideways, who had 4 kids of her own and a patience that he genuinely couldn't explain. There was Mr. Okafor across the hall, 72 years old, retired postal worker, who had taken to leaving containers of food outside Mason's door on Tuesday evenings with no explanation and no expectation of reciprocation. There was the group of 3 brothers on the 4th floor, Dominic, Jesse, and the one everyone called Pip because nobody remembered his real name, who ran a small contracting operation and had, over the years, patched Mason's drywall, replaced 2 windows, and fixed the radiator in exchange for nothing more than Mason drawing up plans for a room addition on their mother's house in Pilsen. It wasn't a community in the organized sense. Nobody had formed a committee or a group chat. It had just happened, the way things happen when people live in the same building long enough and encounter enough broken elevators and power outages and sick children that they either help each other or they don't, and these particular people mostly did. Mason thought about this sometimes when he walked up the stairs. That this, the unremarkable 6 flights, the smell of somebody's cooking, the sound of Lily's voice through the door, was what he'd built. Not the career he'd imagined in his 20s, not the firm with his name on the door, the recognition, the projects in architectural journals. Just this. A daughter who was mostly okay and neighbors who mostly showed up and work that mostly paid the bills. It was enough. He'd decided that. He repeated it to himself more on some days than others. The Henderson project was an office conversion, an old warehouse in Wicker Park that a small developer wanted to turn into mixed-use commercial space. It was the biggest contract Mason had landed in 2 years, and he was 3 weeks behind on the revised drawings because the developer kept changing the internal layout, and Mason kept accommodating him instead of charging for it. He was sitting at his drafting table at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, the apartment quiet, when his phone buzzed with an email from the developer asking if they could move the Friday meeting to a call instead because he needed to bring in a consultant. Mason read the email twice. A consultant. On a project Mason was midway through designing. He typed back, "Sure, no problem. What's the consultant's focus?" The response came 4 minutes later. "Financing is getting complicated. Might need to restructure the scope. Nothing to worry about." He sat with that for a while. Nothing to worry about was what people said when there was something to worry about. He shut his laptop, went to check on Lily. She was asleep on her side, the backpack hung on her bedpost, the photo still tucked in the pocket where he'd replaced it. And then he went and stood in his kitchen and drank a glass of water and looked out the window at the street. The rain had stopped. The street was wet and orange under the lights. He thought, for no particular reason, about the woman in the hotel lobby. The way she'd photographed the backpack so he'd know nothing had been taken. The way she'd asked if his daughter was okay, and then looked slightly surprised that she'd asked. He went to bed. He did not think about her again for almost 2 weeks. He saw her on a Tuesday. He was coming back from a site visit, the Henderson project, which had not been restructured yet but was developing the particular energy of a thing about to be restructured. And he cut through the small park on the corner of his block because it was faster. The park was not impressive. It had a swing set with 1 broken swing, a bench with initials carved into it going back to what looked like 1987, and a tree that had been struck by lightning 2 summers ago and never fully recovered but was still standing, which the neighborhood had adopted as a minor point of pride. A woman was sitting on the intact swing. She was wearing a different coat today, still expensive, and she had her phone in her hand, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the building across the street, Mason's building, as it happened, with the focused attention of someone memorizing details. He stopped. It took him a moment because the context was wrong. She looked up before he could decide whether to approach or keep walking, and recognition landed on her face about a half-second before it landed on his. "The backpack," she said. "The hotel," he said. A pause. She looked for just a moment, caught. This isn't—" She stopped and laughed once, a short sound with no particular warmth in it, aimed at herself more than him. "I was just sitting here." "Okay." he said, because he didn't know what else to say. She looked back at his building, then back at him. Something moved across her face, a decision being made. "Do you live there?" she asked. "For 5 years." "Do you like it?" It was a strange question. He considered it honestly. "Yeah," he said, "I do." She nodded like he'd confirmed something. She stood up, smoothing her coat, and then hesitated. "Aurora Sterling," she said. "I know," he said. "Mason Reed." Her expression shifted, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. Most people, when they said their name, expected to have to explain who they were. "You looked me up," she said. "A friend texted a link. I glanced at it." "Just glanced." "I had a deadline." She smiled at that. Not the polished, controlled version, just a quick thing that got away from her before she could manage it. "I'm going to level with you," she said. "I'm here because of the building." He waited. "There's a development project. A company I have a partial stake in is looking at this block and a few others for a redevelopment proposal. Mixed use, market rate housing. The usual." She said the usual the way someone says it when they've stopped finding it convincing. "I wanted to see it myself before the board presentation started." Mason looked at her for a long moment. "You're looking at tearing down my building," he said. "The company is looking at it. I'm looking at whether that decision makes any sense." "Is there a difference?" She met his eyes. "I'm trying to figure that out." He could have walked away. He had every reason to. A deadline, dinner to make, a phone call from the developer he'd been putting off. Instead, he turned and looked at his building, the way she'd been looking at it. 6 floors, 42 units. Water stains on the 4th floor window that Dell had promised to deal with by spring. The fire escape where Dominic sometimes sat and smoked and where Lily was absolutely not allowed and went anyway. "There are 42 families in there," he said. "Not 42 units, 42 families." "I know. Do you?" She looked at him. Not defensively, just looked. "No," she said. "Probably not." He didn't know why that answer made him more willing to keep talking, but it did. "Lily gets out of school at 3:15, he said. "Carmen on the 2nd floor takes her on Tuesdays when I'm at site visits. Carmen has 4 kids and a mother with a hip replacement, and she takes Lily anyway because that's just what she does." He paused. "You can't replicate that with market-rate condos." Aurora Sterling said nothing for a moment. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not the boardroom calculation he'd expected, but something closer to actually paying attention. "No," she said. "You can't." A kid on a bike cut through the park between them, yelling something at a friend on the other side of the fence. A dog barked 2 buildings down. Ordinary Tuesday afternoon sounds. All of it. "I'm going to be late picking up Lily," Mason said. She nodded. "I'll be here a few more days, looking around." "You could just ask people," he said, "instead of looking." She tilted her head slightly. "Most people don't talk to me the way you do." "What way is that?" "Like I'm a person." He picked up his bag. "You should probably figure out why that is," he said, not unkindly, and walked to the corner. He was late picking up Lily by 4 minutes. She gave him the look. He told her about this woman in the park, and she said, "Was she pretty?" And he said, "That's not the point." And she said, "So yes." And he did not dignify that with a response. Ouch. She came back on Wednesday. This time she knocked on the door of the community room on the ground floor, a converted storage room that had been turned into a shared space about 3 years ago, mostly by Mason drawing up the plan, Dominic and his brothers doing the work, and 8 other residents contributing labor or materials. There was a folding table, mismatched chairs, a shelf of donated paperbacks, and a coffee maker that had outlasted 2 relationships and a pandemic. Mason was there with Lily doing homework at the table when Aurora Sterling walked in. Lily looked up immediately. Children had a radar for adults who didn't quite belong in a space, and Lily's was particularly finely tuned. "She's pretty," Lily said, not quietly enough. "Lily." "I'm just saying." Aurora stopped in the doorway. She was in jeans today, and a blazer that still probably cost more than Mason's rent, but was at least an attempt at casual. She looked at Lily with a directness that adults usually softened around children. "You're Lily," she said. Lily sat up straighter. How do you know my name? Your dad mentioned you. Lily turned to Mason with an expression that contained multitudes. He gave her a look that communicated, do not make this weird, and she turned back to Aurora with transparent calculation. Are you his girlfriend? Lily. We met twice, Aurora said, both times in the rain. Lily considered this. That's kind of romantic. It's really not, Mason said. Can I see your phone? Lily asked Aurora. No, Mason said. At the same time, Aurora said, sure. He looked at her. She shrugged, a small, surprisingly unguarded gesture, and held out her phone. Lily took it with careful hands and looked at it with the attention of an appraiser. It's the same as my friend Priya's, except hers has a crack. She handed it back. Do you work with my dad? No. I'm trying to decide whether to do something that would affect your building. Like what? Mason watched Aurora. She could have softened it, redirected, said something appropriately vague for a child. Instead, she said, some people I work with want to tear it down and build new buildings. Lily put her pencil down. That's where we live. I know. My dad drew the community room. I heard that. Lily looked at Mason, then back at Aurora with the particular focus of someone reassessing a situation. Are you going to let them? Aurora was quiet for a moment. I'm trying to figure out what the right thing is. That's not really an answer. No, Aurora agreed. It's not. The coffee maker on the shelf finished a cycle it had apparently started on its own. Dell had never fixed the timer properly, and let out a long, wheezing gurgle. Lily went back to her homework. Aurora looked around the room with careful attention at the drawings on the wall, 4 of them Mason's, the rest Lily's, at the shelf of books, at the folding table with its mismatched chairs. This doesn't happen in buildings by accident, she said quietly. No, Mason agreed. It takes a while. She stayed for 20 minutes, drinking bad coffee from a styrofoam cup, while Lily finished her math homework and complained about fractions. Mason answered 3 work emails and tried not to watch Aurora watching his neighborhood. She left without making any promises. He told himself that was fine. Why? She came back Thursday and Friday. On Thursday, she talked to Carmen, who was direct in the way that only someone with 4 children and a mortgage and a mother with a bad hip could be. She told Aurora exactly what the building meant, exactly what the neighborhood meant, and exactly what she thought of corporations that bought and demolished communities in the name of urban revitalization, using language that Mason would have edited for a mixed audience but that Carmen delivered without apology. Aurora listened to all of it without flinching. On Friday, she helped Mr. Okafor carry groceries up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was down again, Dell's 3-day delay, and she did it without being asked and without making a thing of it. And Mason, who happened to be coming up the stairs behind them, watched her stop on the 3rd-floor landing to catch her breath and say, genuinely, how do you do this every day? And Mr. Okafor said, the elevator is down about twice a month. And she said, that's insane. And he laughed in a way Mason hadn't heard him laugh before. In the evening on Friday, Mason ran into her in the lobby. She was checking her phone, scrolling with the expression of someone receiving bad news in intervals. Problem? He asked. She looked up. There's a board meeting scheduled for next month. The redevelopment proposal is on the agenda. She paused. 3 of the executives have been pushing it hard. There's a lot of money involved. Is that unusual? Executives pushing projects? Not by itself. She put her phone in her pocket. I keep trying to figure out why it feels wrong. Because you've spent 4 days in the place they want to tear down. It's more than that. She was quiet for a moment. There are documents in the project files I can't access. My own company's files. There are layers of the proposal I should be able to see, and I'm getting redirected every time I try. Mason looked at her. That sounds like someone doesn't want you looking at it. That's what it sounds like to me, too. From the 2nd floor, they could hear Carmen's kids, a burst of shouting and then laughter, some dispute resolved or escalated, impossible to say which. The building was never fully quiet. It never had been. You could walk away, Mason said, from the project. Abstain at the board meeting. Aurora shook her head, and the motion was tight with something that looked like controlled frustration. If I abstain, the 3 of them push it through. The project moves forward. These buildings come down. So what are you going to do? She looked at him for a moment, and he got the impression she was deciding how much of something to say. I'm going to find out what's in those files, she said, and then I'm going to make a decision. She said it like a woman who had made decisions in boardrooms and courtrooms and on stages in front of thousands of people. She said it like someone who'd been making decisions alone for a very long time. Okay, Mason said. Why are you so calm about this? I'm not calm, he said. I have 42 families in this building and a daughter who just made friends with you, and the Henderson project I've been killing myself on for 3 months just told me they might need to restructure scope, which means I might not get paid for half the work I've already done. I'm not calm. I'm just not going to yell at you in a lobby. She stared at him. You're working on the Henderson project, she said. You know it? The Wicker Park conversion, Martin Henderson. You know him? He's one of the 3 executives pushing the redevelopment project. The lobby was very quiet for a moment. Mason felt something cold settle in his chest. Not panic, something more deliberate than panic. He never mentioned that to me, he said. He wouldn't. What does that mean? Aurora looked at him steadily. It means he's been managing you the same way he manages everyone who might be useful to him. Keeping you close, keeping you compliant, not showing you the whole board. She paused. The restructuring he mentioned. What did his email say exactly? That financing was getting complicated. That's the script, she said. He uses it to delay payments, create leverage. He's done it with 4 contractors I know of in the last 2 years. Mason stood there processing this. So he's been stringing me along, he said. Probably. While working on a project to tear down my building. Almost certainly. The coffee maker on the shelf in the community room wheezed through another phantom cycle. Somewhere above them, Carmen's kids laughed again. Mason sat down on the bottom stair, which was not a dignified move but was what his legs had decided to do. Aurora sat down on the stair beside him, which he hadn't expected. I have maybe 6 weeks of money saved, he said. If the Henderson project falls through, I need to find new contracts immediately or I'm in trouble. I know. That's not why I'm helping you, if that's what you're thinking. It wasn't. He looked at her. She was sitting on the stairs of his building in her expensive blazer, her phone still in her pocket, and she looked like someone who had spent days coming to a decision she hadn't fully announced yet. Why does this building matter to you? He asked. Really? You've seen 100 communities like this one. You've seen the proposals and the projections. Why does this one bother you? Aurora was quiet for a long moment. Because I grew up in one, she said. Different city, different building, same stairwell. She paused. When I was 9, our building was sold to a developer. We got 30 days' notice. My mother moved us into her sister's apartment for 8 months, while we were on a waiting list for subsidized housing. I watched my mother lose her neighborhood and her neighbors and the specific shape of her life, and I watched her never entirely get it back. She said it carefully, like something kept in a box that she was opening with controlled hands. I built a company, she said, and somehow I ended up with a stake in a project that does exactly what was done to her. Mason didn't say anything. I'm not looking for absolution, she said. I'm just answering your question. I know, he said. They sat on the stairs for another few minutes without speaking. Upstairs, Lily was watching something on her tablet. Mason could hear the faint sound of it through the ceiling. The files, he said eventually. The ones you can't access. What do you think is in them? Contract manipulation at a guess. Inflated bids, kickbacks, money moving between connected entities. Martin and at least 2 others on the board have been doing this for longer than just this project, I think. She looked at her hands. I need the documents. What kind of documents would help you? She looked at him. Why? Because I've been doing work for Martin Henderson for 3 months. I've been in that building. I've been in the offices. He paused. And I'm a very good architect, which means I pay attention to structures, and sometimes the structures that matter aren't the ones made of concrete. Aurora Sterling looked at him for a long moment. You'd be putting yourself at risk, she said. I'm already at risk. That's what he did when he used my work as cover for whatever he's running. She nodded slowly. I'm not going to promise you it works out. I know. People with more resources than either of us have tried to go against boards like this. I know that too. From upstairs, Lily's tablet sound cut off, and a moment later her voice came floating down. Dad, can we have the rice with the chicken, or do we have to have the plain chicken? He stood up. The rice, he called back. 20 minutes. He looked down at Aurora, who was still sitting on the stair looking up at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, but that wasn't the hotel lobby calculation, and wasn't the boardroom version either. Something more uncertain than that. Something more human. You should stay for dinner, he said, if you don't have somewhere else to be. She seemed genuinely startled. I don't get invited to dinner very often, she said. That's probably something you should also figure out. She stayed. Lily demanded the seat next to her and talked for 40 minutes straight about fractions, her teacher, her best friend Priya, and a book she was reading about a girl who could talk to animals, to which Aurora listened with complete attention and asked follow-up questions that Lily found deeply satisfying. Mason cooked chicken and rice and tried not to think too hard about the fact that his kitchen was approximately 60 square feet and his cabinets didn't close properly, and his daughter was currently explaining the rules of an imaginary game she'd invented to a billionaire at his second-hand kitchen table. When Aurora left at 9, Lily looked at Mason and said, She's going to help us, isn't she? I don't know, Mason said honestly. Lily thought about this. She asked about my book, she said. Like she actually wanted to know, not like grown-ups do when they're just being polite. He rinsed the plates. She had a building like ours when she was little, he said, and someone took it away. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she'll help us, she said, with the certainty of an 8-year-old who had decided, and climbed down from her chair and went to get ready for bed. Mason stood at the sink for a while after that. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday night rhythms. The pipes knocked. The tree that had been struck by lightning was still standing in the park on the corner. He turned off the kitchen light. He still had the Henderson project files open on his laptop in the converted closet. He sat down in front of them and began, carefully and methodically, to look at them the way an architect looks at a structure. Not for what it showed, but for where the load-bearing walls had been moved without anybody saying why. It took him until past midnight. By the time he stopped, he had 6 pages of notes and the particular cold certainty that comes from finding exactly what you were afraid you would find. He sent Aurora Sterling a message at 12:47 a.m. I think I found something. Her reply came in 4 minutes. I'm still up. Send it. The 6 pages Mason had sent her were not organized the way a financial analyst would have organized them. They were structured the way an architect thinks, in layers, in load-bearing relationships, and the question of what was holding weight that wasn't supposed to be there. Aurora had read them twice before she understood what she was looking at, and then she'd read them a 3rd time because she wanted to be wrong. She wasn't wrong. Martin Henderson had been running his contracting billings through 3 separate shell entities, all of them connected to the redevelopment project through a holding company that appeared nowhere in the documents Aurora had been given access to. The architecture was clean enough that a casual review would miss it entirely. But Mason had been inside Henderson's office building, had reviewed the physical plans for the Wicker Park conversion, and had noticed, because he was the kind of person who noticed, that the structural costs in the permits didn't match the structural costs in the invoices, and that the difference was moving somewhere specific. She'd called her own legal team at 7 in the morning. Her lead counsel, a cautious woman named Bridget Cho, who had been with her for 6 years, had listened to the summary and said, Aurora, if you're right about this, you need to be very careful about how you move. Henderson has 3 board votes locked. If he gets wind that you're building a case, he'll accelerate the project timeline and push the vote through before you can block it. I know. You also need a source who can testify to the document chain. Your architect friend, he's not my friend. She'd paused. He's someone I know. A silence from Bridget that communicated precisely what she thought about that distinction. He's potentially a witness and a target, Bridget said. If Henderson figures out that the information came from the Wicker Park project files, Mason Reed becomes a liability problem for him. Aurora hadn't liked hearing that out loud. It was one thing to know it abstractly. It was another to hear it said plainly by a lawyer at 7 in the morning. She didn't tell Mason any of this when she showed up at his building at noon that day. She wasn't sure why. She told herself it was because she didn't have enough yet. Not enough confirmation, not enough of a plan. She told herself it wasn't because she was starting to find it difficult to think clearly when she was about to say something that would put a complicated look on his face. He was in the community room, working at the folding table with his laptop open and 4 printed pages spread in front of him, held down at the corners by a coffee cup, a stapler, and 2 of Lily's drawings that he'd recruited as paperweights without apparently noticing. He looked up when she came in and said, "You read them." 3 times. The structural cost discrepancy on the 4th floor plans is where the money is moving? Yes. She sat down across from him. The holding company is called Veris Holdings. I spent the morning trying to trace it. It doesn't appear in any document I have access to, but it appears in a city permit filing from 8 months ago, listed as a co-investor in the redevelopment project. Mason looked at her. So they've been planning this for at least 8 months. At least. Probably longer. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his pages. One of Lily's drawings was a house with a very tall tree, crayon green, slightly tilted. The other was what appeared to be a horse, but might have been a dog. He didn't seem to see them. "Henderson delayed my payment twice," he said. "Both times he said it was a financing issue. I thought it was normal cash flow management." He set down his pen. He knew what he was doing with this building. He was stringing me along the whole time. Yes. While he was planning to... He stopped. Yes. Mason sat back in his chair, and she watched him work through something internal that he didn't put into words. His jaw tightened. He picked up the pen again, clicked it twice, and set it back down. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need to know if there are other documents, anything Henderson gave you directly, project briefs, budget summaries, anything with his signature or the Veris Holdings name. He gave me a project scope document in month 1. I have it somewhere in my email." He was already opening his laptop. "He also sent physical copies of the permit applications. They're in my files at home." Physical copies with his signature? Yeah. That was more than she'd hoped for. She sat across from him while he searched his email, and she watched him work. The focused quiet of someone who'd spent years operating in the gap between what projects were supposed to cost and what they actually cost, who understood that the documents were never the whole story and that the whole story lived in the spaces between the numbers. He found the email chain in 11 minutes and turned the laptop to show her. She read through it carefully. Henderson's project scope document referenced a budget line for structural assessment and remediation that corresponded exactly to one of the shell billing routes Mason had identified. It was the kind of detail you'd walk past in a single read. It was the kind of detail a lawyer could do something with. "Can you forward this to me?" she asked. "Already doing it." She heard her phone buzz in her pocket. She didn't take it out. Instead, she looked at him, and he looked back. And there was a moment that was just the 2 of them sitting across a folding table in a converted storage room with bad lighting and crayon drawings used as paperweights. "This might get difficult," she said, "before it gets better." "You mentioned that." "I'm mentioning it again because last night I didn't fully explain what difficult looks like." She kept her voice level. "If Henderson figures out you've connected the dots, he could come at the Henderson project invoice. Claim breach of contract, non-performance, whatever his lawyer suggests. He can't actually win that case if we have the documents, but he can make it expensive and slow." Mason looked at her steadily. "You're telling me I could spend money I don't have defending myself from someone who's already not paying me?" "Yes." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "And if we don't move on this?" "The board meeting is in 5 weeks. The redevelopment vote passes. Demolition notices go out 60 days after that." He looked at his building. Not at her, at the wall, as if he could see through it to the stairwell, the 6 floors, the 42 families. "Okay," he said. "That's it? Okay? What else am I supposed to say?" She didn't have an answer to that. She looked down at the email chain on his laptop screen, at Henderson's name in the signature block, at the date stamp from 3 months ago when Mason had still thought this was just a job. "I want to be honest with you about something," she said. "You haven't been?" "I have. She paused. I came to this neighborhood with a specific purpose, to assess a business decision. I wasn't planning to know anyone here. I figured that out. The fact that I know you now it complicates things. Strategically, if Henderson's people look into my recent activities, they'll find I've been in this neighborhood for a week. They'll connect me to you. That could be used to paint the whistleblowing as personal rather than principled. Is it personal? She held his gaze. It's both. He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something. So what do we do with that? We move carefully and quickly. And honestly, she thought about that for a second. Yes, she said. And honestly. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps. Lily coming home, Carmen's voice behind her calling something about tomorrow, the door of the second-floor apartment closing, the ordinary percussion of the building in the afternoon. Mason tilted his head slightly, listening, and she watched something in him settle. Not relax, but locate itself. She'll want to know you're here, he said. I know. Is that okay? She was surprised to find that it was. Yeah, she said. It's okay. Lily came downstairs 4 minutes later with her backpack over one shoulder and an assessment ready before she'd fully cleared the doorframe. She looked at Aurora, looked at Mason, looked at the papers on the table. Are you two working? She asked. Trying to, Mason said. Lily pulled out the chair beside Aurora and sat down with the decisiveness of someone who had decided where they belonged. She unzipped her backpack, the purple one, broken zipper, still hanging on by its remaining teeth, and pulled out a math worksheet. I have fractions again, she announced. I can see that, Aurora said. Do you know fractions? I have a degree in applied mathematics. Lily looked at her with the particular skepticism of an 8-year-old who has been lied to about homework help before. Okay, but do you know fractions? Aurora took the worksheet and looked at it. Numerators, denominators, mixed numbers, the specific torture of the third-grade curriculum. Yes, she said. I know fractions. Lily leaned over and pointed at problem 6. That one's wrong on purpose, she said. I want to see if my teacher marks it. Mason looked up from his laptop with an expression that suggested this was not a new behavioral pattern. That's not a great strategy, Aurora said. I just want to know if she reads them. What if she does? Lily thought about it. Then I'll do them right next time. Aurora looked at her, this small, direct, entirely unsentimental person, and felt something that she didn't have an immediate category for. Fair enough, she said. She helped with the fractions. Problem 6 stayed wrong. The next 3 weeks moved in a particular rhythm that Mason hadn't planned for and didn't quite know how to account for in his internal inventory of his own life. Aurora came to the building most days, not always for long. Sometimes she was there to work. She'd claimed a corner of the community room as a secondary workspace, her laptop and her legal pad, alongside Mason's drafting printouts, which meant the room now had the particular productive tension of 2 people who worked differently, but competently, circling the same problem from opposite angles. Sometimes she was just there, talking to Carmen or Mr. Okafor, learning the building in the way you learn a thing you've decided to understand rather than just observe. Mason watched her do this without commenting on it. He noticed that she was careful with people, not warm in the easy, performed way of someone running a charm operation, but genuinely careful, in the way of someone who had learned that people were worth paying attention to and was still, on some level, surprised to believe it. She listened more than she talked. She asked questions that showed she'd retained what she'd been told the previous time. She was different here than she was in the moments when her phone pulled her back into whatever the company was doing. Those moments had a shift in her posture, something that went tighter and more deliberate, a person putting on a more functional version of herself. Bridget Cho called daily. There were apparently other lawyers, a communications team, and a board liaison who kept sending messages. She answered briefly and without warmth. They're getting nervous, she told Mason one evening. Henderson's people can feel something moving. I haven't tipped my hand yet, but 3 weeks of me not being in the office and not approving the redevelopment preliminary documents has started a clock. How much time do we have? 2 weeks before the board meeting, maybe less if they call an emergency session. They were sitting on the fire escape outside Lily's bedroom window. Lily was inside, asleep, and the fire escape was technically for emergencies, but had become the de facto quiet place for conversations Mason didn't want drifting through the building. It was a clear night, which in Chicago in October meant cold, and Aurora had borrowed one of his old zip-up hoodies because she hadn't planned to be outside, and it sat wide on her shoulders, and she hadn't seemed to notice. Bridget found 2 more shell entities connected to Veris Holdings, she said. Both of them were used in projects Henderson ran 2 years ago. Different buildings, different neighborhoods, same structure. We have a pattern. Is that enough? It's close. We need one more thing, the flow of funds into the holding company's primary account. We have the billing records, we have the permit filings, we have Henderson's signed correspondence with you, but we need to show the money actually moved. How do you get that? We have a forensic accountant working on it, and she stopped. And? One of the other executives, the youngest one, a man named Garrett Yue. He came to me last week privately. He didn't know about the document chain yet, but he'd noticed the same structural anomalies you did. He's scared and he wants out. He'll cooperate? If we can protect him. Bridget's working on that. She paused. He had access to the Veris Holdings primary account statements. He copied them before he came to me. Mason was quiet for a moment. The city moved below them. A car, someone's music from 2 buildings over, the particular sound of Chicago late at night. So you're close, he said. Close, not there. What happens if you go to the board meeting without everything locked down? She looked out at the street. They vote. The project moves forward, and then I spend months litigating it through channels that move slower than demolition crews. He looked at the side of her face, the particular expression of someone who had been carrying something without letting anyone see how heavy it was. You've been doing this alone for a long time, he said. She didn't answer immediately. That's usually how it works. Is that a preference or just what happened? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, when you run a company like mine, people around you have interests. Everyone wants something. Your decisions have consequences for people's careers, their money, their futures. It's very hard to know when someone is actually with you versus when they need you to do a specific thing. So you stop trusting people. I stopped assuming I could tell the difference. That's not the same thing. She looked at him. No, I guess it isn't. The cold had gotten serious. Mason could see her breath. She'd pulled the hoodie tighter without remarking on it. Lily asked me this morning if you were going to be at her school thing on Thursday, he said. Aurora went still. What school thing? She's in It's a small thing, a class presentation. Parents come, a few other people if the kid invites them. He paused. She apparently invited you. She didn't tell me that. She told me to tell you. I think she was hedging her bets. A long pause. I have a call Thursday morning. The thing is at 2. Another pause. I don't know if that's... Mason, she's 8. I don't want her to... I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I'm not a fixture. I don't want her to think of me as a fixture, and then what? She pressed her lips together. Things end. He looked at her for a moment. She knows things end. She's more realistic about that than you'd expect. He paused. She's not asking you to stay forever. She's asking if you want to see her talk about the water cycle for 4 minutes. Aurora looked at the street below them. The water cycle, she said. Apparently it's a good presentation. She's been practicing. Something moved across Aurora's face. Not the controlled version of herself, but something that got through before she could manage it. Something that looked, for a moment, like a person who hadn't been invited to something small and ordinary in a very long time and didn't quite know what to do with it. Okay, she said. I'll be there. He nodded, didn't make anything of it. They sat for a few more minutes in the cold, until Aurora's phone buzzed and the board liaison needed a response, and she went back inside, and Mason sat alone on the fire escape for another few minutes, watching the street and not thinking too hard about the way the evening had settled around them with a familiarity he hadn't planned for. Thursday came, and she was there at 1:55 p.m., 5 minutes early, standing outside the school in a coat that was still expensive, but that she'd paired with flat shoes instead of the usual heels, which he noticed and said nothing about. Lily spotted her from across the gym, and her face did something complicated. A flash of relief, quickly managed into coolness, a performance of not caring that she was completely transparent about. "You came," Lily said. "You invited me. I wasn't sure you'd—" Lily stopped, adjusted. "The water cycle is important. I heard." Lily's presentation was 4.5 minutes. She'd made a poster with careful handwriting and had memorized more than she'd written down, which Mason knew and which clearly surprised her teacher. She talked about evaporation with the particular confidence of someone who has practiced enough that they're no longer performing, but just saying what they know. When she got to precipitation, she made a sound effect that got a laugh from the other parents and turned red about it in a way that was completely unlike her usual self-possession. Mason watched Aurora watch Lily. There was no performance in it, no diplomatic smile, no social management. She just watched, and she was entirely present, and at one point her expression did something that Mason cataloged carefully and put away somewhere he wasn't going to examine too closely. Afterward, in the school parking lot, Lily said to Aurora, "Did you actually know about the water cycle, or did you just say that?" "I know about the water cycle." "What's the difference between condensation and precipitation?" Aurora told her, correctly and in more detail than was strictly necessary, and Lily nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose test has been passed. "She said you're smart," Lily told Mason, pointing at Aurora. "She didn't say that," Mason said. "I implied it," Aurora said. Lily looked between them with the speculative calculation of an 8-year-old who had been watching two adults interact for 3 weeks and was forming conclusions. "Are you going to eat dinner with us again?" she asked Aurora. "I wasn't planning. We're having pasta," Lily said. "I'm helping." She means I'm boiling the water," Mason said. "She doesn't actually help." "I stir it," Lily said. "You stir it once and then you leave and I deal with the rest." "That's helping." Aurora looked at the two of them. This exchange so routine it barely registered as exchange, this father and daughter who argued in the shorthand of people who had long since stopped needing full sentences. And she said, "Yes, okay, pasta." Lily looked vindicated and walked ahead of them toward the car, and Mason fell into step beside Aurora, and they didn't say anything for a moment. "She's going to be fine," Aurora said quietly. "Whatever happens with the building, with the project, she's going to be fine because of you." He looked over. She was watching Lily, not him. "She has a lot of people," he said. "It's not just me." "It starts with you." He didn't answer. The afternoon had gone the particular gray of late October in Chicago. Not raining yet, but making a commitment to rain by evening. Lily was already at the car, testing the locked door handle with maximum impatience. 1 week, Aurora said. "The board meeting is in 1 week. Garrett Yua confirmed the account statements. The forensic accountant has the flow of funds." "So you have what you need." "Almost. I'm going to go public with it. Not through the board, directly. A statement to the press 48 hours before the meeting, with the documentation. Bridget thinks it's a risk. If the board feels cornered, they might move faster. What do you think?" "I think Henderson has been running this operation for 2 years because nobody looked directly at him. The moment someone does, it falls apart." She paused. "But I could be wrong." "You could be." "I know." "You're going to do it anyway." She looked at him, and this time she didn't pull back whatever was behind her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "I am." Lily honked the car horn from the passenger side, which she was not supposed to be able to reach, which meant she had climbed over the center console, which was also something she was not supposed to do. "Lily," Mason said, at a volume that carried. "I'm hungry," came the response, muffled through the glass. He unlocked the car. Aurora got in the back seat. Lily immediately turned around and began telling her about a dispute she'd had with her friend Priya about which animal was smarter, a dolphin or a crow. And the debate continued through the drive home and through most of the pasta. And Mason cooked and listened and didn't say anything about the fact that there was a moment, around 7:30, when Lily fell asleep sitting upright in her chair at the table and Aurora caught her water glass before it tipped, and the two of them sat in the quiet kitchen for a few minutes after that without needing to fill it. He carried Lily to bed. When he came back, Aurora was washing the 2 remaining dishes. Badly, because she was looking out the window instead of at what she was doing, but she was doing it. You don't have to, I know, she said. He stood in the kitchen doorway. After the board meeting, he said, whatever happens, you're not going to disappear, are you? It wasn't quite a question. She turned off the tap. She didn't answer immediately, and he appreciated that she didn't reach for the easy answer. I don't know what happens after the board meeting, she said. I might lose control of significant company assets. My reputation is going to take a hit either way. I don't know what I look like on the other side of it. That's not what I asked. She turned to look at him. No, she said. I'm not going to disappear. He nodded. Outside, the rain that Chicago had been threatening all day finally committed. It came down hard and fast against the kitchen window, the particular sound of it filling the apartment the way it had been filling this building for decades, and neither of them moved for a moment, just standing in the kitchen light while the storm made its noise around them. The press statement went out on a Tuesday morning at 7 a.m., 46 hours before the board meeting. Aurora had written 3 drafts over the weekend, each one tighter than the last. Bridget Cho marking up the margins with legal cautions, and Aurora cutting language that was accurate but unprovable, and keeping language that was accurate and documented and would hold up in a courtroom. The final version was 4 paragraphs. It named Martin Henderson. It named the 2 other executives. It named Veris Holdings. It attached 6 documents, including Mason's project scope correspondence, the Shell billing records, and the account flow statements Garrett Yui had copied before his nerve had a chance to fail him. Mason read it at 6:58 a.m., standing in his kitchen in yesterday's clothes, Lily still asleep down the hall. He texted Aurora. It's good. It's clear. She replied in 2 minutes. Bridget says we'll hear from their lawyers within the hour. She's right. He made coffee. He stood at the window and watched the street wake up. The first buses, a woman walking a dog that had opinions about the pace, Dell's van pulling into the alley with the mechanical complaint of a vehicle that was never going to be repaired. He thought about the 42 families. He thought about Carmen and Mr. Okafor and Dominic on the 4th floor. He thought about the fact that in 46 hours, a room full of people in expensive suits would decide something that would either save this block or begin the process of erasing it. Then he woke Lily up for school and made her eggs and argued with her about whether her hair needed to be brushed. It did. And drove her to school because it was raining again, and came back and sat at his drafting table and tried to work on a new contract proposal for a small residential renovation that a couple in Andersonville had reached out about, because life continued to require money regardless of what was happening in the background. He was 40 minutes into the proposal when his phone started going. The first call was from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The second was from Dominic on the 4th floor, who said he'd seen something online about the building and wanted to know if Mason knew what was happening. The third was from a journalist at a local outlet who said she was covering the Sterling story and understood Mason Reed had been a source and wanted a comment. He didn't call any of them back yet. He called Aurora. She picked up on the second ring, and he could hear immediately that something was wrong. Not the controlled tension she maintained when things were difficult, but something sharper underneath it. The story's moving, she said. It's faster than we expected. 3 outlets have picked it up, and one of them has a contact inside the company who leaked something we didn't release. What did they leak? A pause. They're saying I manipulated the documentation, that the paper trail was fabricated by my team to neutralize a legitimate development project I opposed for personal reasons. Mason sat with that for a second. Henderson. His PR firm. They moved in 2 hours. Her voice was tight. They're positioning me as a CEO with an agenda, using her legal team to generate false records against executives who challenged her authority. Who's going to believe that? Enough people for it to matter. Aurora Sterling Goes Rogue is a better story than Aurora Sterling Exposes Fraud. One of them has a photo, me, sitting on the front steps of your building. They're framing it as evidence I was conducting a personal campaign in the neighborhood. A pause. Mason, I'm sorry. I didn't anticipate they'd bring you into it this fast. He looked at his phone. There were 2 more missed calls. How bad is it? The stock dropped 4% at open. The board chair called Bridget at 6:30 this morning, asking her to counsel me to postpone the statement. That means someone got to him before our statement even dropped. Her voice did something controlled and hard. They've been preparing for this. I underestimated how prepared. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Does any of that change what the documents show? No. Does it change whether the account statements are real? No. Garrett Yue can verify. Then the story still holds. Mason, the board meeting is in 46 hours, and the narrative is already... I know what the narrative is, he said, but narratives can be answered. What do you need right now? Another pause. Longer this time. I need to be somewhere that isn't my hotel room, she said. I've been staring at the same four walls for 2 hours, and my lawyers keep calling, and I can't... She stopped, started differently. I know that's not a strategic ask. Come over, he said. She hesitated. The press is going to look at where I go today. Then let them look. You said yourself the photo is already out there. Come over. She came over. She arrived 40 minutes later looking like someone who had been awake since 4 a.m. and was refusing to show it, except that she was showing it. A tension around her eyes, a slight imprecision in her movements that he'd learned to read as the physical evidence of sustained stress. She sat down at the folding table in the community room with her laptop and her phone and her legal pad and spent the first 20 minutes in back-to-back calls that Mason stayed out of, making coffee he brought without being asked and letting her work. Carmen appeared at the door around 10, took one look at both of them and said, "Something happened." "We're okay," Mason said. Carmen looked at Aurora. "You don't look okay." "We're working on it," Aurora said. Carmen sat down, uninvited, with the specific authority of someone who had decided that invitation was a formality she'd earned. "My cousin sent me a link this morning," she said, "about the building." She looked at Aurora directly. "They're saying you made things up." "They're wrong," Aurora said. "I know they're wrong." Carmen said it simply, without performance. "I just wanted to hear you say it." Aurora looked at her. "I have 6 documents with signatures and a cooperating witness and a forensic accounting trail. They're wrong." Carmen nodded. "Okay," she said, and got up and left. And that was the entirety of it. Mason watched Aurora watch the door after Carmen left, an expression on her face that he couldn't fully read but that had something disarmed about it. "She just needed to hear it directly," Mason said. "I know." She paused. "Nobody's just needed to hear something from me directly in a long time. Everything goes through communications teams and legal review." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, like she hadn't admitted that before. They worked through the morning. Around noon, Mason went upstairs and made sandwiches, which Aurora ate mechanically while reading something on her screen. He sat across from her and didn't try to fill the silence with anything. At 12:40, her phone rang, and she picked up, and the call lasted 11 minutes, and when she put it down, she sat very still for a moment. "The board chair," she said. "He's calling an emergency session. Tonight. Not Thursday. Tonight at 6 p.m. Mason looked at her. "They're trying to get ahead of the documentation. If they vote tonight, before the full press cycle has time to run, before our lawyers can file for injunctive relief..." She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "The vote passes, the project gets approved, and even if the criminal investigation moves forward, the demolition process starts. It takes months to unwind even a fraudulently approved project. What does Bridget say?" "She's filing an emergency motion right now to delay the session, but judges don't move in hours, they move in days." She looked at him. "I have to be in that room tonight, to vote against the project, to present the documentation directly to the board before they vote. If I can get even 2 of the neutral members to understand what they're looking at..." She stopped. "The problem is that Henderson will be there. He's going to present his counter-narrative in person. He's better in rooms than he is on paper." "Are you?" She looked at him. "I used to be. Before I started letting communications teams write my statements." She said it like something she'd just understood about herself. "I've been running this company for 6 years, and I've gotten very good at the distance management of things. Statements, intermediaries, carefully controlled messaging." She paused. "This needs something different." "You were different this week," he said. "In the building, with Carmen, with Mr. Okafor." "That's different." "Why?" She opened her mouth and closed it. "Because those were real people responding to you as a real person," he said. The board isn't going to be different from that. They're real people who are scared and confused and being fed a story by someone with more preparation time. You have to be more real to them than he is. She looked at him for a long moment. You know I've paid consultants a lot of money to give me advice less useful than that. You probably weren't listening. Probably not. He pulled his chair around to her side of the table. Show me the documentation package. Walk me through how you're going to present it. She looked at him. You don't have to. Walk me through it, he said. She walked him through it. She had the 6 documents organized into a sequence that was logical, but, he pointed out, started with the most technical element, the account flow statements, and would lose a room of executives in the first 3 minutes. He suggested starting with Henderson's signed correspondence with Mason, which was concrete and personal and established a direct line between Henderson's private conduct and the project. She reorganized. She was good at reorganizing. She moved fast, no ego about it, took the suggestion and ran it to its conclusion without needing to be walked the whole way. Garrett Huey called at 2 p.m. He was going to be at the board meeting. He'd retained his own lawyer. He was terrified, which came through clearly even over the phone, but he was going. He's going, she said after hanging up, something loosening slightly in her posture. That matters. It matters a lot, Mason said. If Henderson's lawyers try to discredit the account statements, Garrett can speak to them directly. He was in the room when the transactions were structured. She paused. They're going to go after him. His credibility, his motivations. He knows that? His lawyer told him. He said he'd rather be attacked for telling the truth than safe for keeping quiet. She paused. He's 28 years old. Brave kid. Yeah. Something moved in her expression, respect and something softer underneath it. He called me last week, before he brought me the statements. He just wanted to ask if I was the kind of person who would actually do something with them, or whether I'd bury it to protect the company's value. What did you tell him? That I didn't know yet. She met Mason's eyes. He said that was the most honest thing any executive had ever said to him, so he brought me the statements. Mason looked at her. Were you being honest or strategic? She thought about it. Both, she said. I wasn't sure yet what the right move was, and I was tired of pretending I was always sure. He nodded. You should say that tonight. In that room, when they're watching you and deciding what they believe. That I was uncertain? That you chose honesty over certainty. That's not weakness. That's what the whole case is about. The difference between the people who pretended everything was fine and the one who admitted something was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote something on her legal pad. Outside, the building continued its afternoon rhythms. Dell's van in the alley. The third-floor pipes. Someone's television. The ordinary sounds of 42 families doing their ordinary things inside the walls that Henderson wanted to replace with market-rate condos and favorable billing structures and money that would go to people who already had enough. At 3 o'clock, Mason went to get Lily from school. He told Lily on the way home that Aurora had an important meeting tonight and that things might be difficult for a little while. Lily asked if the building was going to be okay. He said he hoped so. She said, "But you don't know." And he said, "No, not yet." And she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay," in a way that was very much like the way Aurora said, "Okay," not surrender, just acknowledgement. He thought about telling her that. He didn't. When they got back to the building, Aurora was in the lobby, her coat on, her bag over her shoulder, her phone in her hand. She looked up when they came in. Lily went straight to her and hugged her. Not a child's performed hug, but a quick, fierce, direct hug, and then stepped back and said, "Win," and went upstairs. Aurora stood in the lobby looking at the space Lily had occupied a moment before, and something moved through her face that she made no effort to manage. "She's something else," she said. "I know." She looked at Mason. "If this goes badly tonight, it might go badly. If it does, I want you to know—" She stopped. "I'm glad I came back to that park. I'm glad I sat on that swing." He looked at her steadily. "Go do what you're going to do. You're not going to say something reassuring? You don't need reassurance. You need to go be the most honest person in that room. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and walked out. He watched her go through the door. He stood in the lobby for a minute after it closed. Then he went upstairs, helped Lily with homework, made dinner, and waited. The Alderton Group's corporate offices were on the 34th floor of a building downtown, and the boardroom was the kind of room that had been designed to make decisions feel inevitable, floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table that could seat 16, lighting that was indirect and flattering and slightly cold. Aurora had sat in this room dozens of times and had always felt at home in it. Tonight it felt different. Henderson was already there when she arrived, and he looked exactly the way she'd expected. Composed, suited, holding a coffee cup with the ease of someone who believed the evening would go his way. Two of his aligned board members were on either side of him. His lawyer was at the back of the room in an observer's chair. Garrett Yue was at the far end of the table, his own lawyer beside him, looking like a man who had decided to do something and was actively regretting it and doing it anyway. 7 other board members filled the remaining seats. The board chair, a man named Philip Marsh, who Aurora had always found cautious rather than corrupt, opened the session at 6:15 with the visible discomfort of someone who had been in the middle of something all day without fully understanding the shape of it. "We're here to address the preliminary vote on the Varus redevelopment proposal," Marsh said, "and to address the allegations that were published this morning regarding the documentation supporting those allegations. Both parties have been given time to present. Aurora, you requested to go first." Henderson looked at her across the table. Not hostile, almost pleasant, the expression of someone who had decided she was already managed. She put the documentation package on the table in front of each board member. Physical copies, organized in the sequence she and Mason had restructured that afternoon. Henderson signed correspondence first, then the structural billing discrepancy, then the Varus Holdings permit filing, then the shell entity connections, then the account flow statements. She didn't open with the documents. "I want to tell you how I found out about this," she said, "because the counter-narrative you've been hearing today is that I manufactured a case out of personal opposition to this project. So I want you to understand how it actually started." She told them about the building on Karlov Avenue. She told them about the community room and Carmen and Mr. Okafor carrying groceries up 4 flights of stairs. She told them about Mason, not as a romantic narrative, but as exactly what he was, a freelance architect who had been hired by Martin Henderson and had noticed, because he was careful and competent, that the numbers in the project documents didn't add up. "He came to me with 6 pages of notes," she said. "He wasn't a whistleblower. He wasn't part of a legal strategy. He was a man who had figured out that someone he'd trusted had been using him, and he thought I should know." She paused. "That's where the documentation starts, not in my legal team's office, in a community room with bad lighting and mismatched chairs." Henderson's expression had shifted slightly. Not rattled, recalibrating. "The documents speak for themselves," she continued. "Garrett Yue can speak to the account statements directly. I'm not going to spend 20 minutes walking you through accounting structures. What I want you to understand is that this board is being asked tonight to vote on a project that was built on fraudulent billing, and the reason we're voting tonight instead of Thursday is because the people behind that fraud know that 2 more days gives the documentation time to be verified independently." Marsh looked at Henderson. "Martin." Henderson set his coffee cup down. He was good, measured, not defensive. "What Aurora has presented is a compilation of documents that have been selectively assembled to support a predetermined narrative. The Varus Holdings structure is a standard investment vehicle that was disclosed in the original project filings, which Aurora apparently didn't read carefully. The billing discrepancy Mr. Reed identified reflects a standard structural assessment cost reallocation that is documented where?" Garrett Yue said. The room shifted slightly. Yue's voice had been quiet but precise. Henderson looked at him. "Garrett, the reallocation, where is it documented?" Yue opened the folder in front of him. "Because I was in the meeting where the billing structure was set up. I was in the room. And there was no reallocation discussion. There was a conversation about how to route the funds through the Varus account so they wouldn't appear in the consolidated project reporting." He stopped. His hands were not entirely steady on the folder. I know because I asked why we were doing it that way and was told it was standard practice. I have the account statements. Page 4. Yue turned to the board. The transfer date, the amount, and the receiving entity. It matches exactly the billing line in Henderson's project scope. The room was quiet. Henderson looked at his lawyer, a small, contained look. This is a coordinated, he started. Don't, Aurora said. She said it without volume, without heat, and it stopped him. There are 9 people in this room who are going to have to explain their vote tonight. Whatever you say in the next 10 minutes, they're going to remember that they had the documentation in front of them and made a choice. She looked around the table, not Henderson, but the 7 others, the ones who weren't committed either way. I'm not asking you to take my word. I'm asking you to look at the documents and look at what Garrett is telling you and make a decision that you can explain to a federal investigator, because that conversation is going to happen. The question is which side of it you want to be on. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room making up its mind. Marsh picked up the document package in front of him and opened it to the first page. It took 40 minutes. At the end of it, the vote was 7-2 against approving the redevelopment project. Henderson and his closest ally were the 2. The other aligned executive had switched, quietly, without explanation, and voted with the majority. Henderson stood up before Marsh had finished reading the result. He looked at Aurora across the table, and this time there was nothing pleasant about it. You just cost this company $300 million in projected revenue. You costed its credibility, she said. I just documented it. He left the room with his lawyer. Garrett Yue sat in his chair looking like a man who had just survived something and wasn't sure yet what came next. Aurora leaned across the table and said quietly, "Thank you." He nodded once, pressed his lips together, and looked out the window. Marsh called a recess. Aurora stepped into the hallway and called Bridget. "It passed," she said. "Project blocked. 7-2. A pause. "The federal referral?" "Marsh is making it tonight. He said he had no choice." Another pause. "Aurora, you know this isn't over." "I know. The board is going to spend the next 2 weeks doing damage control. The stock is already down. There are going to be calls for your resignation." "I know that too." "And?" She was standing in the hallway outside the boardroom, the downtown Chicago skyline behind the glass wall at the end of the corridor, all that lit geometry going dark at the edges where the lake began. "I'll deal with it," she said. "Bridget, go home. It's late." She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment. Her hands were not shaking. They'd been not shaking all evening, which had cost her something, and now in the empty hallway she let herself feel the weight of it, the exhaustion, the particular loneliness of having done something right and being mostly alone in the doing of it. She got out her phone and typed to Mason, "Project blocked, 7-2. His reply came in less than a minute. "Lily is asleep, but I'll tell her in the morning. Are you okay?" She looked at the message, looked at the skyline. She typed back, "No." But getting there. A pause. Then, "Come over if you want. I'll leave the light on." She stood in the corridor a little longer. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went to get her coat. The building on Karlov Avenue was 35 minutes by cab, through the nighttime city, past the places that were lit and the places that were dark, and the lake that was always there at the edge of things, whether you were looking at it or not. When she got out on the corner, the community room light was on in the ground floor window. The tree in the park that had been struck by lightning was a dark shape against the streetlight, still standing, still stripped on one side where the lightning had taken its piece. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just stood there, and felt the cold and the weight of the evening and the fact that everything was still in motion, still unresolved, still going to require everything she had for weeks or months to come. Then she went inside. Mason opened the apartment door before she knocked, because he'd heard the outer door, and he had 2 cups of coffee already made, not good coffee, the same bad stuff from the community room maker he'd apparently brought upstairs. And she sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands around the cup and didn't say anything for a minute. He sat across from her, didn't push, didn't perform concern, just sat there the way he sat, solid and unhurried, and waited. Henderson's lawyer is going to file something by Friday, she said eventually. Counter allegations. Breach of fiduciary duty probably, or tortious interference. Something to create a parallel legal narrative. Bridget can handle it. I know. She looked at the coffee. It's going to be a hard few months. Yeah. The board is going to be difficult. The press is going to be difficult. I'm going to wake up every morning for a while and read things about myself that are designed to be demoralizing. Are you telling me this or yourself? She looked up. Both, she said. I need to hear it out loud so it doesn't surprise me when it starts. He nodded. Okay. What else? She thought about it. I don't know how to do this part, she said. I know how to run a company. I know how to make decisions in rooms. I don't know how to... She stopped. There are going to be days when this is very hard, and I'm going to need somewhere that isn't my hotel room. He looked at her for a moment. You know that's not a hotel anymore. She looked at him. You've been eating dinner here 3 times a week, he said. Lily has opinions about your schedule. Carmen asks about you. Mr. Okafor left a container of food outside my door last Tuesday, and there were definitely 2 portions in it. He paused. You have somewhere. She held his gaze for a moment, and her face did the thing it sometimes did when something got through before she could manage it. I'm not easy to be around when things are difficult, she said. You've been difficult to be around for 3 weeks, he said. We're still here. She sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the street, and the building made its familiar sounds around them. And in the bedroom down the hall, Lily was sleeping with the photograph tucked in the front pocket of her backpack. And none of it was resolved. None of it was clean. And the months ahead were going to be exactly as hard as Aurora had said they were going to be. But the building was still standing, and the light was on. Henderson's lawyers filed on Friday, as Aurora had predicted. The claim was tortious interference, that Aurora had deliberately sabotaged a legitimate development project using fabricated documentation and a coordinated media campaign. The filing was 62 pages and had clearly been in preparation for longer than the 3 days since the board meeting, which told Bridget Cho everything she needed to know about how long Henderson had been planning his exit strategy. He built the counterattack before we launched, Bridget told Aurora on the phone that Friday afternoon. Which means he knew the documentation existed before you went public. Garrett, Aurora said. Someone near Garrett, or someone in your legal team. A pause. I need you to think carefully about who knew what and when. Aurora was in the community room when she took that call, sitting at the folding table that had become her default workspace over the past several weeks, and Mason was across from her working on the Andersonville renovation proposal that had turned into an actual contract. He looked up when she said Garrett's name, and she shook her head slightly. Not Garrett himself, just someone near him. And he went back to his drawings. She spent an hour after the call going through the timeline with Bridget. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Someone in her own legal team had likely been feeding Henderson's people updates. Not the full documentation, but enough to know a counterattack would be needed. Bridget said she'd handle it. Her voice, when she said it, was the voice of someone who was going to handle it in a way that was thorough and unpleasant and necessary. How bad is the filing? Mason asked after she hung up. 62 pages. It'll take months to litigate, and it's designed to. She set her phone down. The goal isn't to win. The goal is to make the process expensive enough that I settle. Will you? No. She said it without hesitation. But it's going to cost money and time, and it's going to be in the press constantly, and every time it comes up, it'll be framed as Sterling faces legal action over board dispute, which sounds much more neutral than 3 executives arrested for fraud. Have they been arrested? Not yet. The federal referral is moving, but federal investigations don't move in weeks. They move in months. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. Bridget says probably spring before there are formal charges. Mason was quiet for a moment. He picked up his pencil and turned it in his fingers. A habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was thinking through something structural. The building is safe in the meantime? He asked. The project is legally blocked. They can't move on demolition while the fraud investigation is active. Marsh put a formal hold on all related development activity. She paused. The neighborhood is safe. That part is done. He nodded, and she watched something in him settle. Not the full weight off, but one specific weight set down. She understood the distinction. She'd been making it herself for weeks. The Friday after the filing, the first resignation call came. It wasn't from a board member directly. It came through channels, a carefully worded message from Philip Marsh suggesting that, in the interest of stabilizing investor confidence, Aurora might consider whether a temporary step back from day-to-day executive functions would be beneficial while the legal proceedings unfolded. Aurora read the message twice, then called Marsh directly, which he clearly hadn't expected. "Philip," she said, "say it to me plainly." A pause. "There's significant board sentiment that your continued presence as CEO while facing litigation." "I'm not facing litigation. I'm a defendant in a retaliatory filing from someone who was committing fraud. Those are different things." "Aurora, is there a formal motion?" Another pause. "Not yet." "When there is, call me." She hung up. She sat in her hotel room. She'd moved back to the hotel after the board meeting, a practical decision about proximity to her lawyers. And she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for a few minutes. The room was clean and temperature-controlled and entirely without character, and she thought about the mismatched chairs in the community room and the bad coffee and the crayon drawings on the wall. She called Mason. "They want me out," she said. "Not formally yet, but they're moving toward it." "What happens if they push you out?" "The fraud case continues regardless. That's in federal hands now. The building stays protected. But the company—" She stopped. "I built that company. I started it in a rented office with 4 people, and I built it for 6 years. If they remove me, it doesn't matter whether I win the legal case eventually. The thing I built will belong to someone else." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. She appreciated that he didn't reach for comfort reflexively. "Is there a way to fight it?" he asked. "I have voting shares. They can't remove me without a supermajority. I have 31%. They need 67 to push through a CEO removal." She paused. "Marsh has been quietly talking to the other major shareholders. If 2 of the institutional holders go against me, they have the numbers." "How much time do you have?" "Before they try formally, weeks, maybe less." She looked at the hotel room ceiling. "Bridget thinks I should call the institutional holders directly, make the case personally." "She's right." "I know." A pause. "I'm not good at asking people to trust me." "You've been doing it for a month," he said. She went still for a moment. "That's different." "Is it? You've been walking into rooms with Carmen and Mr. Okafor and Garrett Yua and asking them to trust your judgment. The mechanism is the same." She was quiet. "You're not good at asking people to trust you when you care about the outcome," he said. "When it doesn't matter to you, you can do it fine. When it matters, I get careful," she said, and careful reads as distant. "Yeah." She heard him move in the background, the sound of his kitchen, water running. Ordinary evening sounds. "Mason? Still here, so I might lose the company." "I know. I built it from nothing. I have—" She stopped. "I know what I have and what it represents, and I know it's more than most people ever get, and I know that's not nothing. But it's mine. It's the thing that was mine." He didn't try to minimize it or reframe it. He said, "I know," again, simply, and that was what she needed. Not resolution, just acknowledgement. "Come for dinner Sunday," he said. "Lily wants to teach you her card game. It has rules that change constantly in her favor." She almost laughed. It came out strange, half exhaustion, half something genuine. "Okay," she said. "Sunday." The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that restructure a person without announcing that they're doing it. They didn't feel dramatic from the inside. They felt like getting up every morning and making the next decision, and then the one after that, in a sequence that was exhausting and unglamorous and mostly conducted in lawyers' offices and conference calls and quiet conversations at kitchen tables. Aurora called the 2 institutional shareholders. She made the case herself, directly, without intermediaries. One of them, a fund manager named Delacroix, who had held shares since the company's Series B and who Aurora had always respected for his bluntness, told her that he appreciated her calling personally and that he'd been prepared to go with Marcia's recommendation until she called, and that the personal call had changed his read of the situation. He was staying with her. The second holder was harder. A woman named Patricia Sung, who ran a large pension fund and who had two questions. First, whether Aurora's legal exposure was personal or corporate. And second, whether the fraud case could be resolved without Aurora's continued involvement. Bridget handled the first question. Aurora handled the second, and she handled it by being honest. She didn't know how long it would take. She couldn't promise the timeline, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise to get what she wanted. Patricia Sung held her shares. The formal removal motion never materialized. Marsh backed down. Not gracefully, but he backed down, and Aurora didn't make anything of it because she needed him functional, and she wasn't interested in winning points. November became December. Henderson and his two co-defendants were formally indicted on federal fraud charges in late November, which generated a news cycle that reframed the public narrative significantly. Sterling vindicated was the shorthand, though the reality was more complex. Indictments weren't convictions, and the litigation against her was still active, and the company's stock had stabilized but not recovered. There were still opinion pieces that used her name in the same sentence as controversy and boardroom turmoil because that was how media worked. But the building on Karlov Avenue was still standing. Mason got the Andersonville contract, which paid enough to cover 3 months of expenses and refill the savings account he'd been watching shrink. He also got a referral from the couple in Andersonville to a friend who needed commercial space designed in Logan Square, which was smaller but quicker and led to another referral in January. The Henderson money he'd been owed never came. Henderson's personal assets were frozen pending the federal case, but Bridget had flagged the unpaid invoice as part of the fraud damages claim, which meant it was at least theoretically recoverable eventually. Mason did not spend a lot of time thinking about the Henderson money. He spent time working and picking Lily up from school and arguing about hairbrushing and having people over for dinner. Aurora came for dinner most Sundays. It had started as a loose arrangement and had solidified into something neither of them had formally named, which seemed to be working better than naming it would have. She learned Lily's card game, which did in fact have rules that shifted in Lily's favor whenever Lily was losing, and she learned to catch the rule changes and call them out, which Lily found infuriating and delightful in equal measure. Carmen started including Aurora in building conversations with the same matter-of-factness with which she included Mason, not deferring to her or making anything of who she was, just treating her as someone who lived adjacent to the problem at hand and had opinions worth hearing. Mr. Okafor began leaving 3 portions on Tuesday evenings, which he neither explained nor acknowledged. Aurora noticed. She didn't say anything about it to Mason directly, but one Tuesday evening she was in the kitchen when he brought the container in and she said quietly, "He knows." "He's always known," Mason said. "He's just been waiting for you to figure it out." She looked at the container for a moment. "Figure what out?" she said. "That you belong here." She was quiet for a long time after that. It wasn't uncomplicated. Mason was not under the illusion that it was uncomplicated. There were dimensions of difference between them that didn't dissolve because they had dinner together on Sundays. The way her phone never fully went quiet, the way she sometimes sat in the community room looking at something on her screen with an expression that reminded him she was operating inside a set of pressures he could understand intellectually but had never felt. There were moments when the distance between a freelance architect in a walk-up on Karlov Avenue and a billionaire CEO in a legal battle that was making national news felt very concrete and very present. He didn't pretend those moments weren't there. She didn't either. One evening in December, sitting on the fire escape in the cold because the fire escape had become the place for conversations that needed space, she said, "I want to do something real here. The neighborhood." He looked at her. "What kind of something?" "The community room is at capacity. Carmen told me last week that 3 other families in the building have been asking about after-school space for their kids, and there's nowhere to put them." She paused. "The lot on the north end of the block, the one that's been empty for 4 years. The city's been sitting on it. I looked into it. It's available for community development proposals." He was very still. "I want to fund a community center," she said. "Real one. Not large. I'm thinking 8,000 square feet, maybe 10. After-school space, a small kitchen for community programming, meeting rooms." She paused. I want you to design it. He looked out at the street. The lightning-struck tree still standing in the park, the building's worn brick face, the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable texture of a neighborhood that had been almost taken away. Aurora. I know it sounds like a gesture. It doesn't sound like a gesture, he said. It sounds like what you've been building toward since you sat on that swing. She looked at him. I just want to know if you're doing it because of the neighborhood or because you want a reason to stay. She was quiet for a moment. The cold sat between them. Both, she said. I've been both since the beginning. She held his gaze. Is that honest enough? Yeah, he said. It is. He looked back at the lot on the north end of the block, the empty space that had been empty for 4 years, the gap in the block's geometry that had always seemed like an absence rather than a possibility. 8,000 square feet, he said. 10 if we can get the permits. The ground conditions on that lot are going to be interesting. There was a structure there before. I'd need to do a full site assessment. He was already thinking in load-bearing terms, in floor plan terms, in the question of how you build something that belongs to a place rather than just occupying it. North-facing on the main facade, which means we plan for light carefully. We'd want the community space to get afternoon sun. Can you do that? I'd need to look at the lot properly. Get the city records. He paused. And you'd need to deal with the permits yourself. I'm not going through another Henderson situation. You deal directly with the city office, she said. I'll fund it. You run the design and construction oversight. He looked at her. That's a lot of trust. I know. You trust me with 10,000 square feet of your money. I trust you with more than that, she said without elaborating and looked back at the street. He didn't push it. He sat with it instead, the way you sit with something that is real and complicated and not yet fully formed but clearly present. December moved through itself. The legal proceedings continued their slow institutional grind. Mason filed the initial request with the city for records on the North End lot. Lily's school did a winter performance that both Mason and Aurora attended, sitting in plastic chairs in a gymnasium that smelled like old sneakers, watching 23 children sing about weather patterns with varying degrees of commitment. Lily was in the front row and sang louder than anyone, which was consistent with her general approach to most things. Afterward, in the parking lot, Lily said to Aurora, "Did you like it?" "I liked it," Aurora said. "I was the loudest." "You were definitely the loudest." Lily looked satisfied. "My teacher says I have projection," she said, as if this were a diagnosis she'd received and was learning to live with. Mason drove them home. Lily fell asleep in the back seat, which happened sometimes on the way home from evening events. Her head tipped against the window, the city passing outside in its nighttime colors. Aurora was in the passenger seat, and she was looking at Lily in the rearview mirror with an expression that she probably didn't know was on her face, something unguarded and full, something that hadn't been managed or measured. Mason kept his eyes on the road and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The new year arrived without ceremony, the way New Year's do when you're in the middle of things. January brought a continuance in the Henderson case, a cold snap that took the pipes on the 3rd floor down for 2 days and tested Dell's commitment to his profession, and the city's approval of Mason's records request for the North End lot. He spent 3 evenings going through the site records and came back to Aurora with the assessment. The lot was buildable. The previous structure's foundation had been partially removed but not fully, and the ground conditions would require specific footing design, but nothing that was beyond what a competent structural engineer could handle. He brought the preliminary sketches to the folding table in the community room, just rough drawings, early thinking, and she looked at them with the focused attention she brought to everything, and asked 2 questions that showed she understood what she was looking at. "The main entry," she said, pointing at one of the sketches. "It faces east." "It faces the park," he said. "I want people coming into the building to come toward the neighborhood, not away from it. The park is the orientation point." She looked at the sketch for a long moment. "That's right," she said. "Not a compliment. An assessment." He appreciated the difference. Carmen came in while they were working and looked at the drawings over Aurora's shoulder and said, "Is that a kitchen?" pointing at a rectangle in the lower floor plan. "Community kitchen," Mason said. "Large enough for programming, cooking classes, that kind of thing." Carmen was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down and said, "I've been trying to teach neighborhood cooking for 2 years. I've been doing it in my apartment." She paused. "My mother's kitchen in Puerto Rico had a big table. Everyone came. I've been trying to figure out how to do that here." Mason looked at her. He hadn't known that. "Tell me what you need for the kitchen," he said, and pulled out a fresh page. That was how the program list started. Not in a planning meeting, not in a strategy document, but at a folding table with bad lighting when Carmen said, "I've been trying to do this for 2 years." Over the next 2 weeks, more conversations happened in that same unplanned way with Mr. Okafor, who wanted a space for the older residents to gather that wasn't someone's apartment, with Dominic, who said he'd heard about it and wanted to know if there was room for a small tool library, with a woman on the 5th floor named Sylvie, who ran a small tutoring operation out of her living room and had more kids than she had space for. Mason took notes on all of it and went back to his drafting table and revised the floor plan 4 times, because the building that was taking shape in the sketches was no longer abstract. It had Carmen's kitchen and Mr. Okafor's gathering room and Sylvie's tutoring space and a tool library off the side entrance that Dominic had very specific opinions about. It was a building built for specific people doing specific things, and that was the only kind of building Mason had ever found truly worth making. He showed Aurora the revised plans on a Sunday evening in late January. After dinner, Lily in her room, the apartment quiet. He spread them on the kitchen table and talked her through the changes. Not just what had changed, but why. The conversation behind each revision, Carmen's kitchen, and the way it was oriented to get morning light, the gathering room that Mr. Okafor needed to be accessible off the main entry. She listened to all of it. When he finished, she looked at the plans for a long time. "This is the best work you've done," she said. "I haven't drawn the building yet. These are just plans." "I know, but you can see it already. You can see the people in it." He looked at the drawings. She was right. You could. The specific shapes of the people who had asked for specific things were visible in the floor plan, the way the stories of people who'd built a place together were always somehow visible in the structure, if you knew how to look. "I want to tell you something," Aurora said. He looked up. "The last 4 months have been the hardest months I've had since I started the company. The litigation is ongoing. The board is functional, but not what it was. My reputation in certain circles is going to take a long time to rebuild." She paused. "I've lost things, real things. Assets, relationships, influence I spent years accumulating." "I know. And I want to tell you that none of it—" She stopped. Started again. "I don't regret any of it. Not the statement, not the board meeting, not the building on Karloff Avenue." She met his eyes. "And not Sundays. And not the fire escape. And not any of it." He held her gaze. "Aurora." "I'm not good at this part," she said. "Saying what I mean directly without it going through 6 layers of management." "You're doing fine. I need you to know that what I have here, with you and Lily and this building, it's the thing I didn't know I was missing, and I noticed it was missing before I knew that you were what was filling it." She paused. That probably sounded more articulate in my head. He looked at her. This woman who had faced down a boardroom full of people trying to dismantle her and hadn't flinched, who was sitting in his kitchen under his bad overhead light, struggling to say something simple to one person. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." "Why didn't you say something?" "Because you needed to get there yourself." He paused. "And because I wasn't entirely sure you were going to stay." She looked at him. "I told you I wasn't going to disappear. You told me that in a lobby when you were deciding whether to trust me. I needed to see what came after the deciding." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, "And?" "And you stayed," he said simply. "You stayed when it got hard, and you stayed when you had every reason to go, and you've been showing up for months. That's not a decision anymore. That's who you are." The apartment was quiet around them. The pipes were behaving, which was not guaranteed, but was tonight's situation. Down the hall, Lily's tablet made a small sound and went quiet. Aurora reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held it, and neither of them made it more complicated than that. They stayed at the kitchen table for a while, the building plan spread between them, the community center taking shape on paper, the people it was built for already visible in its bones. The permits came through in March. Mason was at his drafting table when the email arrived, and he read it twice to make sure he was reading it correctly, and then he went downstairs and knocked on Carmen's door and showed her the screen without saying anything. She read it, looked up at him, and said, "Finally," with the particular tone of someone who had been waiting long enough that relief had bypassed excitement and arrived directly at confirmation. Then she hugged him, which he hadn't expected, and he stood in her doorway being hugged while one of her kids ran past their legs and didn't notice. He called Aurora from the lobby. "Permits cleared," he said. A pause. Then her voice did something he'd been learning to recognize, the version of her that wasn't managing the response, that just reacted. "When?" "Email came in 10 minutes ago. Full approval. We can break ground in 60 days if we move on the contractor." "Dominic," she said, "I already texted him." She laughed. A real one. The kind that got out before she could shape it into something more composed. He stood in the lobby of the building on Karlov Avenue and listened to Aurora Sterling laugh in his ear and thought that there were a handful of sounds he would remember from this period of his life, and that was one of them. "I'm coming over," she said. "I figured." She was there in 40 minutes. She came through the door with her coat still on and went straight to the community room where Mason had rolled out the final construction drawings on the folding table, waited at the corners by the same coffee cup and stapler, and yet, still there, still recruited, 2 of Lily's drawings. She stood over the plans with her hands on the table edge and looked at them with the expression she'd had the first time she saw the revised floor plan, the one that saw the people inside the building before the building was built. "You changed the entrance again," she said. "I widened it. The original spec was 36 inches. I went to 42. Carmen told me her mother uses a walker. I don't want anyone to have to turn sideways to get into a room that was built for them." Aurora looked at him. "You didn't tell me you changed it." "It was my call to make. You hired me to design a building, not to document every decision. That's 42 inches of my money. And it's the right 42 inches. She looked back at the plans, and he could tell she was deciding whether to push back on the principal and deciding not to because she knew he was right, and because they'd been navigating this particular dynamic long enough that she knew when to let it go. "Okay," she said, 42 inches. Dominic came down 20 minutes later, and they spent 2 hours going through the construction sequencing. Dominic had brought his brother Jesse, who did most of the structural work in their operation, and who spent the first 15 minutes of the meeting being visibly intimidated by Aurora, and the last 45 minutes having a direct and detailed conversation with her about load calculations that Mason observed with amusement and said nothing about. By the time they finished, they had a start date. May 14th, 63 days from the permit clearance. Lily, when told, announced that she wanted to be present for the groundbreaking, and that she had ideas about what should be said at the ceremony, and that she thought there should be music. Mason said there wasn't going to be a ceremony. It was just breaking ground. And Lily said every important thing deserved a moment, which was delivered with such complete conviction that neither Mason nor Aurora had a response ready. "She's right," Aurora said. "Don't encourage her." "She's objectively right." Lily looked vindicated. She went and got a notebook. The Henderson trial date was set for September. The federal case had moved with the particular institutional patience of something that would eventually be definitive, but was in no hurry about it. Martin Henderson had retained the kind of legal representation that generated continuances and procedural motions like a factory generates exhaust. Not to win outright, but to delay, to erode, to make the process expensive enough that something cracked. Nothing cracked. Bridget Cho had been doing this for 20 years, and she treated each motion as a minor administrative inconvenience and filed her responses with the steady efficiency of someone who had never once considered losing. Garrett Yue had cooperated fully with federal investigators. He'd been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, which he'd given in a 7-hour deposition that Mason heard about secondhand through Aurora, who'd heard about it through Bridget, who described it as thorough and credible, and the kind of thing that made prosecutors feel comfortable about their case. Garrett was no longer with the company. He'd quietly moved to a smaller tech firm in Seattle, which Aurora had facilitated without making it obvious that she'd facilitated it, because he was 28 years old and had done the right thing at considerable personal cost and deserved to land somewhere. The retaliatory litigation against Aurora had been quietly dropped in February. Henderson's lawyers had filed a notice of voluntary dismissal with no accompanying statement, which was the legal equivalent of leaving a room without making eye contact. Bridget had called Aurora when it came through and said, they ran the math and decided the discovery process was going to hurt them more than help them. And Aurora had said, good. And that was the conversation. The stock had recovered by April, not fully, not back to where it had been before the board crisis, but to a level that the financial press described as stabilized and that Aurora privately described as acceptable. She'd spent the winter restructuring the board, replacing 2 of the seats with people she'd chosen carefully, people whose primary qualification was that they asked inconvenient questions and didn't stop asking them when the answers got uncomfortable. Philip Marsh remained as chair, diminished and cooperative, which was the best outcome Mason figured she could have hoped for with him. She was still CEO. She'd remained CEO through every month of it, and she ran her company with the particular authority of someone who had been tested in a specific way and had not broken. And the people around her seemed to understand that something had changed in her. Not softened, exactly, but reoriented. Less distance between the person who made decisions and the decisions being made. She was still most herself, Mason thought, at the kitchen table on Sundays. There was a conversation they'd been having in pieces since January, incomplete sentences gathered over several months that had been building towards something. He hadn't pushed it into a formal shape because it wasn't ready yet, and because some things needed to arrive in their own time rather than be scheduled. He'd learned that with Lily, that certain conversations happened in the car on the way home from somewhere, or at the sink while doing dishes, or at 10:30 at night when she came to find him with something she'd been sitting on since morning. The important things rarely arrived at the convenient times. Aurora's important things tended to arrive on the fire escape. It was late April, warm enough finally that the fire escape was comfortable without coats, and they were sitting out there after dinner. Lily inside, nominally doing homework, actually doing whatever she was actually doing, when Aurora said, my lease at the hotel is month to month now. Mason looked at her. I've been month to month since January, she said. I keep renewing it, and I keep thinking about why I'm renewing it. What do you come up with? That I've been waiting to see what happens. Whether this, she gestured vaguely, encompassing the fire escape and the building and the street below. Whether this is what I think it is. And? She looked at the street for a moment. The tree in the park, fuller now than it had been in the fall, the lightning damage less visible under the new growth. A kid on a bike somewhere below them, the sound of it before the sight. I think it's exactly what I think it is, she said. He looked at her. Lily asked me last week if I was going to live here, she said. I told her I lived at a hotel. She said that wasn't the same as living somewhere. She paused. She's right. She's almost always right. I know. It's annoying. A corner of her mouth moved. Mason, I'm trying to say something. I know what you're saying. Then say something back. He looked at the street below, the ordinary, specific, irreplaceable street he'd looked at from this fire escape for 5 years. He'd come to this city by choice, and stayed by accident, and then stayed by decision. And somewhere in that sequence, this particular view had become the shape of what home looked like to him. There's a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor opening up in June, he said. Dell told me last week. The Pattersons are moving to be closer to their daughter. Aurora was very still. It's not large, he said. Smaller than your hotel room, probably. The pipes on that floor are noisy and the afternoon light is better on the south side of the building than where they are, but the view is toward the park. She was looking at him with an expression that had gone past the managed version of herself entirely. Are you asking me to move into your building? She said. I'm asking if you want to live somewhere instead of at a hotel. Mason. I'm also asking if you want to be here. Specifically here. Specifically with us. He paused. If you're not ready for that, the question can wait. But I don't think you're not ready. I think you've been ready for a while, and you've been letting the logistics have the conversation your feelings already finished. She looked at him for a long moment. Lily knows you asked me this, she said. Lily suggested it. Aurora went still. She suggested it. About a month ago, she told me that Aurora didn't have a real home and that we had a building, and that seemed like a solvable problem. Her words. He paused. She's 9. Her emotional intelligence is embarrassing. Aurora looked out at the street. He watched her doing something internal, not deciding, he thought, because that part was already done. Adjusting. Letting the reality of a thing she'd already decided settle into the physical fact of saying yes to it. "The 3rd floor," she said. "3rd floor, south-facing, bad pipes, view of the park. I want to see it before I say yes. Obviously. And I want to talk to Lily directly. She'll be thrilled. Try not to let her negotiate anything." Aurora looked at him, and then she did something that was not managed and not composed and not the version of herself she'd spent years building. She leaned sideways and put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the fire escape in the late April evening and watched the street below them without needing to make anything of it. "I've never lived in a walk-up," she said. "The elevator works maybe 70% of the time. That's terrible. Dell's working on it." "Dell has been working on things since October." "He gets there," Mason said. "Just give him time." She made a sound against his shoulder that might have been exasperation, or might have been something that just sounded like it, and the evening settled around them, and the tree in the park held its shape in the last of the daylight. Lily's reaction, when Aurora spoke to her directly 2 days later, was to look at her with the calm assessment of someone who had been expecting this conversation and had been patient about waiting for it. "You're going to live in the building?" Lily said. "3rd floor, if the apartment works." "It's smaller than ours." "I don't need as much space as you think I do." Lily considered this. "You could have dinner with us more." "That was part of the thinking, yeah." Lily looked at her with those eyes that took everything in and gave very little back until she'd finished processing. "Are you and my dad together?" she asked. Aurora paused. "Yes," she said. "Is that okay?" Lily seemed to weigh this with genuine seriousness, and Aurora sat across from her at the community room table and did not rush it, which was the right thing to do. "My friend Priya's mom has a boyfriend," Lily said finally. "He's fine. He comes to things sometimes." "That sounds like a reasonable arrangement." "You already come to things." Lily picked up her pencil. "You came to my water cycle thing." "I did." "You cried a little." "I did not cry." "Your eyes got wet." Aurora held Lily's gaze. "That's an important distinction." Lily went back to her worksheet. "Okay," she said, in that particular tone that meant the decision had been made and the discussion portion was concluded. "You can live here." Aurora stayed at the table for a moment after that, looking at the top of Lily's head bent over her work, the careful handwriting, the purple backpack hung on the back of the chair with its broken zipper that was never going to be fixed because Lily refused to let it be fixed. She thought about her mother's apartment when she was 9, the 30-day notice, the 8 months in her aunt's spare room. The way her mother had never fully gotten her neighborhood back because neighborhoods weren't interchangeable, because the specific combination of people and history and ordinary routine that makes a place home takes years to build and can be demolished in a morning. She thought about the empty lot on the north end of the block and what was going to be built on it. She thought about a rainy evening and a hotel lobby and a purple backpack with a broken zipper. The things that change your life, she had come to understand, are almost never announced. They come in sideways through revolving doors, in the form of a near fall and a brief apology and a child's photograph tucked in a front pocket. They come as a man sitting on a bottom stair making space for the weight of something real. They come as a building with bad pipes and a perpetually under-repair elevator and 42 families who had decided, over years of small shared acts, to mean something to each other. You don't recognize them when they arrive. You only recognize them afterward, when you try to trace the line back to where things changed, and you find it was always smaller and more ordinary than the change itself. Construction began on May 14th as scheduled. Mason was on site at 7 in the morning before the crew arrived, standing on the empty lot with a coffee cup from the diner on the corner and the final construction drawings in a roll under his arm. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of spring morning that Chicago offered occasionally as an apology for winter. The lot looked different now than it had in October when Aurora had first mentioned it, cleared of the last of the old debris, the ground marked with survey stakes, the potential of it visible in a way it hadn't been when it was just an absence. Lily had insisted on being there for the first day. She'd woken up at 6:30 without being asked, which had never happened on a school morning in her life, and had appeared in the kitchen already dressed with her backpack over one shoulder and the expression of someone attending an important event. "You know this isn't a ceremony," Mason had said. "Every important thing deserves a moment," she'd said, and poured herself cereal with the authority of someone who had made their point definitively and was done discussing it. Aurora arrived at 7:15 with 2 more coffees and the architectural site binder Mason had sent her the previous week, tabbed and annotated in the margins in her handwriting. He'd learned that she annotated everything she read, not notes for other people, but the working evidence of her own thinking, shorthand that was sometimes more useful than the original document. Dominic's crew pulled up at 7:30. 5 people, 2 trucks, equipment for the initial foundation excavation. Dominic got out and looked at the site, and then at Mason and said, "This is the one," not as a question. "This is the one," Mason said. They broke ground at 8:03, which was not a scheduled time and had no ceremony, but Lily, standing at the edge of the lot in her school clothes, said quietly, "Okay," as the first excavator bit into the ground, and that was enough. Carmen was watching from the window on the second floor. Mr. Okafor was on the front steps of the building with his morning coffee. 3 other residents Mason could see from where he was standing. None of them made a production of it. They were just there, the way they'd always been there for the things that mattered in this block. Not with fanfare, but with presence, which was the only kind of witness that actually counted. The construction took 4 months. It was not smooth. Nothing involving construction in Chicago in the summer is smooth. There were material delays, a 2-week pause when the original structural engineer had a family emergency and they had to bring in a replacement, a stretch in July when the heat index hit 104 and the crew worked half days, and Mason was at the site every morning before 6 to get his site walks done before the full heat arrived. The pipe issue on the 3rd floor manifested in a new and creative way in August that had nothing to do with the community center, but consumed 3 days of Mason's bandwidth and Dell's full professional attention. Aurora came to the site twice a week. She didn't hover. She looked and asked specific questions and left Mason to run the project, which he'd told her at the outset was the only arrangement he'd work under. She honored it, mostly. There were 2 moments when she had opinions about decisions that were Mason's to make, and she expressed them. And in one case she was right, and he adjusted, and in the other case he held his position and explained why, and she said, "Fair enough," and that was that. She had moved into the 3rd floor apartment in June, in a process that was less dramatic than Mason had expected and more revealing. He'd assumed she'd bring very little, that a hotel dweller for months would have accumulated minimally. What he found was that she'd been collecting things, quietly, for longer than she'd apparently admitted to herself. Books, mostly. A few pieces of art that were genuinely interesting rather than expensive looking. A kitchen setup that was better than his, which Lily pointed out immediately, and which became the source of a recurring disagreement about whose kitchen was better for Sunday dinners that had no resolution and didn't need one. She learned to live in the building the way you learn anything real, imperfectly and gradually, and by getting things wrong before getting them right. She set off the smoke alarm twice in the first month, once with toast, and once in an incident involving olive oil that she declined to fully explain. She left her shoes by the 3rd floor landing twice before Mason said something about it, and she moved them without argument. She learned that the hot water on the 3rd floor ran cold for 90 seconds before warming up, and she learned to account for it, and she stopped mentioning it, which was how you knew something had become home. Not when it was convenient, but when you'd absorbed its inconveniences into your routine. Lily started coming upstairs to Aurora's apartment on weekday afternoons when Mason was working. Not every day, but regularly enough that it became a known pattern. Aurora helped with homework sometimes, badly with some subjects and well with others, and Lily learned which was which and brought the relevant assignments accordingly. They watched things together. They talked. The way 2 people talk who have chosen each other for reasons that have nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the specific fit of one person's presence against another's. Mason didn't manage this. He watched it happen and let it happen, and understood that the thing you can't manufacture or engineer was doing itself, the way the good things do when you stop getting in their way. The community center opened on a Saturday in October. 1 year and 3 days after a rainy evening in a hotel lobby where a man had stepped on the hem of a woman's coat and neither of them had looked away quite fast enough. Mason had not planned to mark that correspondence. It arrived in his awareness on the morning of the opening, standing in front of the building's entrance, 42 inches wide, correct? Looking at what had been built on an empty lot that had been empty for 4 years, and he'd done the mental date arithmetic and stood there for a moment with that knowledge. 1 year. The ceremony that Lily had insisted on was not large. The invitations had been word of mouth through the building and the immediate neighborhood, and the result was maybe 60 people gathered on the sidewalk in the newly finished front plaza. Carmen's entire family, Mr. Okafor in his good coat, Dominic and Jesse, and the one everyone called Pip. Sylvie, from the 5th floor with 4 of her tutoring students, a handful of other residents, and a small cluster of people Aurora had invited from her professional world. People who'd supported her through the worst months, who were here not for the business story, but because she'd asked them personally. Garrett Huey was there. He'd driven from the airport that morning. He was standing near the back, slightly removed from the crowd, and when Aurora spotted him, she went directly to him, and they spoke quietly for a few minutes. And Mason, watching from across the plaza, couldn't hear what was said but could see what it was. 2 people who had made a decision in a difficult moment and were, 1 year later, standing in the evidence of what that decision had built. There were no formal speeches. Aurora had specifically ruled out formal speeches. What there was instead was a series of moments. Carmen opening the community kitchen and standing in it for the first time in the space she'd been trying to create for 2 years, running her hand along the counter edge with the expression of someone taking real inventory of something they'd waited for. Mr. Okafor at the door of the gathering room, which was light and accessible and faced the park, standing still in it for a full minute before saying anything. Sylvie's tutoring students, 4 of them, walking into the study room and immediately claiming corners, which was both the correct response and the most useful thing that had happened all day. Dominic walked the whole building with Mason at one point, just the 2 of them, moving through the rooms they'd built together, and Dominic said, "You know what's good about this?" And Mason said, "Tell me." And Dominic said, "It doesn't look like it was designed by someone who doesn't live here." Mason thought that was possibly the best review he'd ever gotten. The afternoon moved through itself. Someone had brought food. It started with Carmen's contributions and expanded, without coordination, into a collective spread that covered 3 of the new community room tables, the way food appears at neighborhood events when people know each other well enough to show up without being asked. Lily was everywhere, moving between conversations, introducing people to each other with the authority of a person 3 times her age, occasionally grabbing Mason's arm to pull him towards something she thought he needed to see. At one point she disappeared for 20 minutes, which Mason noted with the particular parental awareness that registers absence before it registers concern. He found her at the back of the main room with Aurora, the 2 of them sitting in 2 of the new chairs in the corner near the windows that faced the park. Lily was holding something in her lap that Mason couldn't see from where he was standing, and Aurora was looking at it with an expression that had gone entirely still. He started across the room. As he got closer, he saw what Lily was holding. A small box, deep blue, the kind that comes from a jewelry store. Where she'd gotten it, he did not immediately understand. He was still 3 steps away when Aurora looked up and saw him, and her expression did something he'd never seen it do before. A complete and unmanaged openness. Something that had bypassed every layer of competence and control and arrived directly at the person underneath all of it. He stopped. Lily looked up at him. "I found it in your coat pocket 2 weeks ago," she said, entirely matter of fact. "I've been waiting for the right moment." He stood there. "Lily." "This is the right moment," she said with the absolute certainty of someone 9 years old who has decided. She held the box out to Aurora. "He's been carrying it around. He just doesn't know when to do things sometimes." Aurora looked at the box. Then she looked at Mason. Her eyes were doing what they'd done at Lily's water cycle presentation, the things she'd denied afterward that had clearly been exactly what it looked like. "You've been carrying it for 2 weeks?" she said. "I was working up to it," he said. "How much longer were you planning to work up to it?" "I hadn't set a deadline." Aurora made a sound. She opened the box. The ring inside was not complicated. Mason was an architect. He thought in terms of structure and purpose and the rightness of materials for their function. and what he'd chosen was a single stone set cleanly in a band, nothing excessive, the kind of thing that would look the same in 40 years as it did today. "You picked this yourself," she said. "Yes, without a consultant." "I know what you like." She looked at him. "Ask me." He crossed the remaining distance between them and crouched down in front of her chair, which put him at eye level with her, and he was aware in a peripheral way that the room had gone quiet and that Carmen was somewhere behind him, and that Lily was next to them with the expression of someone at the conclusion of a very satisfying project. "I am not going to tell you I can offer you things you don't already have," he said. "You have more than most people can imagine. You built it from nothing, and you've held on to it through things that would have broken someone else." He paused. "What I can offer you is this building and this neighborhood and a kid who already decided you belong here before I worked up the nerve to ask, and Sunday dinners and the fire escape, and the specific kind of honest that you told me once was rare." He looked at her steadily. "I know what you came from, and I know what it cost you to come back to it. I know you chose this place when it would have been easier to choose something different, and I want to be the person you keep choosing, if you'll have me." Aurora Sterling, who had built a company from nothing and survived a boardroom coup and a federal investigation and months of public scrutiny without flinching, sat in a chair in a community center that hadn't existed a year ago and looked at a man in front of her with wet eyes that she was definitely not going to describe as crying. She looked at Lily. "You've known about this for 2 weeks," she said. 2.5, Lily said, "and you didn't say anything to me." "I was waiting for the right moment." Lily gave her the particular look that contained, somehow, the patience of someone much older than 9. Also, he needed to be brave enough to do it himself. Aurora looked at Mason again. He was still in front of her, still waiting, with the steadiness she'd been leaning on for a year. Not unaffected, she could see the effort of this in him, the controlled stillness of a man who had learned to be very calm about things that mattered to him because the alternative was not acceptable. And she thought about a hotel lobby and a rainy evening and the $40 checking account and the way he'd looked at her like she was a person on the day most people looked at her like a resource. She thought about her mother's kitchen and the 30-day notice and the 8 months in the spare room and the things she'd spent 20 years building back from that. Not just the company, but the internal sense of being someone who couldn't be taken from a place, who couldn't have the specific shape of her life demolished by someone else's decision. She'd built walls so she couldn't be taken anywhere against her will, and then she'd sat down on a broken swing in a park, and everything she'd built to protect herself had turned out to be the thing she needed to set down. "You saved my future long before I saved yours," Mason said quietly. She looked at him. "That night in the hotel lobby," he said, "you photographed the backpack so I'd know nothing had been taken. You asked if my daughter was okay. You didn't know us. You didn't owe us anything, but you paid attention." He paused. "You were already the person this neighborhood needed before you knew this neighborhood existed. You just had to come find out." Aurora took the ring from the box. She looked at it for a moment, the clean line of it, the rightness of the materials, the thing designed not to impress but to last. "Yes," she said. Not a performance, not a managed response, just the word, said directly, the way she'd learned to say the things that mattered. He put the ring on her finger. Behind them, the room erupted in the particular chaos of 60 people who had been trying and failing to pretend they weren't watching. Carmen's voice, first and loudest, Mr. Okafor's dignified applause, Dominic's brothers saying something to each other that ended in laughter, Garrett Yue clapping near the back with the expression of a man who had driven from an airport that morning and had now decided it was worth it. Lily, sitting beside them, looked at the two of them with the satisfied expression of someone whose project had concluded correctly. "I told you this was the right moment," she said. Mason looked at his daughter. "You went through my coat pocket. You were taking too long." Lily, that's my pocket." "You're welcome," she said serenely, and got up to find Carmen and tell her the news as if Carmen had not witnessed it from 8 feet away. Aurora watched her go, her hand in Mason's, the ring newly on her finger, the noise of the building's people filling the rooms they'd built together. She was laughing, the real kind, the kind that had been coming more easily for months now, the kind that didn't need to be checked before it arrived. "She's going to be like this forever," Mason said. I know, Aurora said. I love it. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, in the building that had been almost taken and had been saved, in the neighborhood that had held itself together by the ordinary force of people deciding that other people were worth the effort, in the specific light of a late October afternoon coming through windows that faced a park where a lightning-struck tree was still standing. They were married 4 months later in February on the ice at the lakefront. Not a grand ceremony, not a production, but 20 people standing in the cold on the frozen edge of Lake Michigan, their breath visible, the city behind them and the gray open water ahead. Carmen did Lily's hair. Mr. Okafor wore his good coat and stood in the front row with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been leaving 3 portions of food outside a door since October and had always known this was how it ended. Garrett Yue was there. Bridget Cho was there, wearing a scarf that Mason suspected had cost more than his first month's rent and not minding the cold at all. Lily was the flower girl, which she had requested with the specificity of someone who had opinions about her role in proceedings. She took it seriously. She walked with the deliberate attention of someone doing an important job correctly. The ceremony was short because it was cold and because short felt right, because everything that needed saying had been said over a year of folding tables and fire escapes and Sunday dinners and bad coffee and a card game with rules that shifted in Lily's favor, and what was left was simply the formal acknowledgement of what had already been true for a while. When Mason and Aurora said what they'd said to each other, standing on the ice with their hands joined and their breath making small clouds between them, Lily stood beside them with her flower basket and looked between them with the expression of someone witnessing the conclusion of something that had begun long before she'd understood what she was watching. Afterward, walking back from the ice with Lily between them, her gloved hand in each of theirs, the lake behind them and the city ahead, Mason thought about what he'd told Aurora at the community center, that she'd saved his future before he'd saved hers. He still believed that. He believed the direction of rescue in a story was always less linear than it appeared, that people don't save each other sequentially, but simultaneously and imperfectly, each one catching the other at different points in the fall. He thought about the $40 in his checking account, and the bus schedule he'd miscalculated, and the purple backpack with the broken zipper that Lily still refused to replace, the small hinge on which everything had turned. Lily, walking between them, said, "Are we going to get lunch? I'm really cold and also hungry." "Yes," Aurora said. "Absolutely yes." "Can we go to the place with the grilled cheese?" "The one on Belmont?" Mason said. "You know what place. That grilled cheese takes 45 minutes. It's worth it," Lily said, with complete authority. Aurora looked at Mason over Lily's head, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Just the two of them, and a 9-year-old who was always right about the important things, walking away from the lake and back into the city, into the ordinary and irreplaceable life they'd built from what they'd had, which, it turned out, had been enough all along. It is a quiet truth that most people learn too late. The life you didn't plan is often the one most worth keeping. Not because hardship is noble or struggle is romantic. It isn't, and anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't been broke with a sick kid and a deadline and an uncertain future. But because the life you didn't plan is the one where you were actually present for the choosing, where nothing was assumed, where every person who stayed did so by decision rather than default. Mason hadn't planned any of it. Not the city, not his daughter, not the freelance work that paid unevenly and demanded everything, not the empty lot that became a building, or the building that held a community together by the accumulated weight of small, ordinary kindnesses. He just kept showing up, kept making the next decision, kept being the kind of person who goes out in the rain for a photograph tucked in a front pocket. Aurora had built a fortress to protect herself from losing something the way her mother had lost it, and had spent years inside the fortress wondering why it felt so much like being alone. The answer, when it came through a broken swing in a park, and a man who looked at her like she was a person, and a child who asked direct questions and didn't soften them for politeness, and a community room with bad lighting that turned out to be more structurally sound than anything she'd ever built from money. Lily, for her part, had known from the beginning. She'd known the day Aurora came to her school presentation, and her eyes got wet. She'd known when Aurora came back to the building after the board meeting and sat in the kitchen with her hands around a bad cup of coffee, like someone who had finally found the right place to put them down. Some people see things clearly before the rest of us catch up. The trick is to listen when they tell you. The building on Karlov Avenue was still standing. The community center was open. The lightning-struck tree in the park was still growing, the new branches filling in around the damage. The scar still visible, but no longer the whole story. The elevator was still broken, approximately 30% of the time. Dell was working on it.